I'll be co-hosting Airing Addiction with Lisa Blanchard.
No one story is the same as someone else's. Everybody's journey is different.
Thing on the table.
Having run substance use treatment programs for over 20 years, trying to make sure that we are welcoming to all. The idea that kind of having that exposure and that affirming place, even for one person, impacts that milieu, which then can impact maybe the broader recovery community, the community at large. I mean, I really love that thought.
To Airing Addiction. We have a really special episode today. I'm so excited. We're going to do a big recap of 1 year anniversary. So we've been doing this for a year. So let me introduce today's special co-hosts. We have Lisa Blanchard as usual, and our extra guest, James Gangemi, who is behind the scenes. So I'll hand it over to Lisa, who can give you a sort of a recap of what we're going to do, and then we'll roll.
Thanks so much, Cathy. This was really great this past week, kind of thinking about what we would talk about today on this 1 year anniversary of Cathy and I co-hosting, and James being our fabulous producer, kind of the fantastic team that we've developed here. And so what we're going to spend some time doing is just kind of talking about, a little bit about ourselves, what we've learned, kind of some of our favorite moments in the podcast, some themes that we feel are pretty recurrent. And that kind of keep coming up, and then kind of what's next? Like, what do we want to do with this podcast kind of going forward, and really, kind of expanding our reach if possible. So with that, I think it's a great place to start with just sharing a little bit more about ourselves, right? So often, Cathy and myself will ask a lot of questions. We might share a little bit about our backgrounds or about what we do, but we really haven't talked a lot about ourselves, right? We're always so focused on the fabulous guests that we've had that, listeners might not know a lot about kind of, why are we doing this, and who are we, and what are we doing? And they especially don't know much about James, right? Because he's the guy behind the scenes, making sure that the sounds are muted, that, if my dog's barking at the FedEx guy, that's not a challenge. And so, I think that would be kind of a great place for us to start. So I'll start with a little bit more about me. So I actually have been with Spectrum and New England Recovery Center for 22 years. When I say that out loud, it sounds really crazy to me, but I have been, and I've had probably about 15 different positions at Spectrum. I didn't really intend on becoming kind of an addiction treatment provider, right? I had started more on the mental health side, and working with our admissions team in the mental health clinics, and then really just kind of fell in love with the addiction work. The more I got involved in operations and in clinical operations and got my, advanced degree in licensure, I realized just how important the work is, how unrecognized, how valuable the work is, and the fact that we really do see phenomenal change. And so it really kind of going to work every day, although it's hard some days, right? It's really hard when we talk about those that we might have lost, or how difficult the work is, or how challenging it is to run programs when there's just not a lot of people that want to go into this field, and all of the things, but recognizing how possible recovery is, and being any small part in helping somebody on that journey, really, I think kind of is what gives me kind of meaning to my life, at this point, especially working in medications for opiate use disorder programs, which has been a lot of what we do at Spectrum and New England Recovery Center, is connect people to evidence-based treatment. We really get to see people over the long term, and you get to really see significant change over that time. And I think that's hard to do in any behavioral health field. In inpatient settings, sometimes you only see people when they're not doing well and they come back, and in outpatient, and because we have the capacity to do, the full kind of continuum of care, at Spectrum and New England Recovery Center, we get to see people really change, positively. And so I guess that's kind of a bit about what is important to me. And so doing this podcast is just another extension of that, right? Is to share those recovery stories, be honest about what the challenges are and have some real conversations, but kind of share that out kind of on the airwaves, right? Have that available to just the general public to hear about, what does, substance use disorder, what does addiction look like, and what does recovery look like, kind of, and how do we kind of grow that movement. So I guess that's kind of a little bit about me. I'm a licensed mental health counselor. So I'm kind of the clinical side here. And with that, I'll kind of turn that over to Cathy, who's got kind of a different perspective and probably some different reasons why she's here.
Yeah, I love that. And the truth is, every time we're doing an episode, I'm always thinking, I have to interview Lisa. I have to get her, because you always inspire me to have these questions like I want to ask more and dig into you. So hopefully today I'll get to those. But the reason I am so inspired by this is I've been in recovery for a long time. This past March, I celebrated 23 years in recovery. So for me, being clean and sober is just my passion now. I'm still very, very connected to my recovery, and I work it, I work it on a daily basis. So the reason this podcast is just incredible is because I feel like I can just dig in from the recovery side of things to get to the clinical and hear a little more about, and sometimes I look back and I think, oh, I didn't go to treatment. And I'm so jealous of all those who did, because it's such a wonderful opportunity. I think there's a whole world of treatment that I knew nothing about. I mean, did it exist? Absolutely, it existed. However, I didn't know anything about it. And so hearing about it and making, even if it's just the life of one person trying to get recovery, making that person's life a little bit easier during the initial stages, to me, that this show is worth it, because I just think, we don't have to suffer. We don't have to suffer, and we never have to be alone. And I just think, through my own personal journey, it's just been a joy, and I've been so hopeful the entire time. So this experience of doing the podcast with you and James and all the amazing guests we've had just warms my heart to know that, I can just spread the joy of recovery just a little tiny bit, and give someone hope. That's what I hope I always get out of this show. So that's what I've been feeling about it. And so my backstory is that I'm in recovery, and I love recovery, and I hope I always get to impart that take on our questions and on our guests.
And you do, right? So like, one of the things I wanted to just add to that is there is no recovery without the person living with recovery, right? Like, there is that, you can't have these conversations about addiction without those with lived experience kind of being at the table and having a voice. Right. And so that's what I really appreciate, that you bring, and you've brought such wonderful guests, right, to us that have kind of have lived experience in lots of different ways. So I just want to appreciate you for that.
Thank you.
James, do you want to share a little bit about how you kind of ended up here?
Absolutely. So, yep. So I've been behind the camera. I've been making sure the stream runs smooth and handling production stuff. So you folks don't get to see me very often, but here I am. So I'm the guy behind the camera. So I worked for Spectrum for about 2.5 years. I'm in IT, so IT operations. So we're making sure that Spectrum and New England Recovery Center, all of their IT operations are running smoothly. And as an IT professional, it's really cool to work. It's not really cool. It's great. It's awesome to be able to work for a company who has a mission where you really do change lives. You do help people, and even being behind the scenes to kind of support that and to make sure everyone has the tools they need to help people in recovery is it's an awesome privilege. So that's what I do at Spectrum. And I also work for a sound lighting company, Supreme Sound and Lighting, on the side, and we do a bunch of stuff. So that's how I was able to, help everyone produce this, and that's my experience I bring to the table. So I've done a number of different shows and music festivals and stuff. So one of them was I did Rhode Island Comic Con, and I've got to meet a lot of famous movie stars, and handed microphones to Danny Trejo, and I've met the cast from The Office, so I was doing sound for them, and I mixed a show for Epic Rap Battle. So I've done quite a bit production wise. So I was able to, really try to bring Airing Addiction together. And I really wanted to use the tools of the trade to make Airing Addiction be able to reach out and just touch many other people's different lives. And because technology is useless without a people focused solution, or to serve a people need. So, it's really cool to be able to leverage this technology to be able to do these things, because we've shared so many different stories on this show. And I look at all the guests and the different, all the different stories that they have brought to the table with how they have taken their recovery and they've turned it into, a business, or they turned it into a clinic to be able to help others. And that's so cool to see. And normally when, you're in your own recovery process and you're going through that, there could be times where I'm sure that's really discouraging and you probably feel like you're the only one doing it. But, to hear these other people come on and then be able to talk about, well, hey, this was my journey. This is my recovery story here. And this is what I went through, and you're not alone. That's really cool to be able to do that. And especially with the wide variety of people we've had on the show. So, I really hope that Airing Addiction has encouraged you and has been able to just show you all the different types of backgrounds and stories that people have come from. It's really cool. So I've really enjoyed it, and it's been a big passion of mine to help you all do that. So that's my story.
And what I love about that is that, nobody does anything alone, right? So whether it's in your IT role, like nothing shines more than IT in the middle of a global pandemic, when
You're busy.
we have to move to completely virtual solutions and deploy laptops and tablets and microphones and be able to continue to support people, right? And use the skills in that way. And I love that you're also using kind of your production skills, right, to further Spectrum's Individual Recovery Center's mission, right? Like that's just so awesome, because, we'll talk a little bit about kind of, some of the themes, and connection and support is definitely one of those that we'll talk about today. And I think that's all forms of support, right?
I would agree. And I would say also James is, thankfully, we've gone from a 1 or 2 space platform of maybe being on Facebook or on a podcast to being able to cast a much wider net. And hopefully with that, we're able to catch more people to hear the show and grow the audience. So that's also something that James has done behind the scenes. I have to put a pitch in for that.
Yeah, you will find Airing Addiction anywhere there's podcasts. So if you have Google Music, Spotify, it's on there. So we want you guys to hear these stories because they're wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah,
I love it. So do we want to kind of shift gears to start talking about kind of some themes and some favorite moments from the past
absolutely
year?
Yes, we had so many great moments. I love it.
So I think kind of the first theme, which I think is my personal favorite, and I think Cathy probably yours too, because I hear you talk about it so often, is that theme of hope, right? And that recovery really is possible. And so kind of one of our very first show, which is still one of my very favorite shows, right, was with Beck G. Cohen, a trans man in recovery, that we used actually kind of last Pride Month. And so now we're kind of in Pride Month again. And I think it's a great opportunity to kind of talk about this again. But one of the things he said so early on in the podcast was something about, when he saw someone with recovery and she had this sparkle in her eye, and that was something he wanted. And so, I wonder, James, can we play that?
When I got sober, I had a friend who was in recovery, and she had what I wanted. Like, she had like a sparkle in her eye, and there was something about her that I wanted, and I found out it was recovery. And it's easy as that.
Do you hear it, James? Okay.
Yep. There it is. Just played it.
Okay, perfect. And so what I love about that statement is it really reinforced why I was doing this podcast in the first place, right? Like to hear like things like that stick with me, when I'm sharing them with other people. And that moment he recognized that, this person had something he didn't have. And that might be recovery, and that might be something worth trying. Even if he had felt hopeless before or had felt like it wasn't possible for him, maybe I can try this recovery thing. So I don't know what your thoughts are, Cathy, especially from your perspective.
Yeah, from my perspective, the same exact thing happened to me when I went to my first recovery meeting, that I heard a little piece, a glimmer of hope. And I thought, this is true. If this person can do it, I can do it. And because it was so appealing, and I think that's what we're trying to do, is make recovery appealing. And I agree with you. And I think Beck was a fabulous first guest. I think we might have to actually ask him to join us again, because there was so much wisdom there. And it really opened my eyes to a lot of information. So I agree. He's full of hope.
And I love his perspective, in support of the LGBTQ plus community, and recognizing that often that community is kind of overrepresented with substance use disorder, but underrepresented in treatment, right? And what can we do as a treatment, provider group, like to make safe spaces a little more safe, to make them more welcoming, to even diversify, the treatment provider staff, in order to reach, more individuals that might need services and might feel like they, aren't welcome or aren't part of that space. And so he gave us some really great kind of practical.
I agree. And I would say, for anyone listening or not as familiar with New England Recovery Center, we are very LGBTQ plus friendly. And I know we've had a lot of clientele in, and I think it's important to note that these topics that we cover help us improve our own services. And I've noticed that through the ongoing education, things you do behind the scenes yourself, Lisa. So I think that's another plus of having the show, is that we're learning and helping ourselves help our clients.
Right. I'm hopeful to have Beck be one of the trainers to do ongoing sustainable training to our teams. Right. So if I put it out here into the universe, then that will happen. Right. So that's
exactly
one of the things that I hope. And one of the things, Cathy, that you said about making kind of recovery attractive, I think we also heard with Tyler Forte, one of our other guests, who actually had been at New England Recovery Center. That was a real treat for me, I remember, because often it's like I mentioned in my kind of review of kind of how I got here is, in an inpatient setting, we often don't see when we're the last stop before somebody enters long-term recovery, right? Like we only see when people come back, and that's, just another step in the process, and we're always okay with that. But that can be hard for treatment providers to only see people back when they're not doing well. We don't often get to see when we were part of that kind of last step for someone.
I agree. And
we were.
Yeah. And if anyone's listening to this and they hadn't heard that episode, Tyler often talks about, or Tyler's mother somebody talks about the fact that someone at New England Recovery Center left such a lasting impression with what she said. And the fascinating thing is, I've done my homework behind the scenes on this, and it is our own clinical director, Mary Beth Adams, that they're talking about. So I think that's a nice heartwarming story as well.
Mary Beth is wonderful, and it's no surprise to me that she left that impression on Tyler. And so I think, James, do we have a clip about kind of that conversation with Tyler on making recovery attractive, so folks can kind of hear what we were talking about?
Sure do. Let me roll it.
Had a strong desire to attract people to recovery the way that was given to me.
Awesome. Thank you. And, one of the things, having heard it from Tyler now, is that kind of sticks with me is what he then did with it. Right. So, sometimes kind of when you see that kind of, that, just like Beck said, that sparkle in someone's eye, or that potential in someone in that recovery, and you kind of want it too, because it looks more attractive than what you're going through, then you want to share it, right? And so I think that's exactly what Tyler does, right? Is he takes that kind of making recovery attractive and he multiplies it, right? By doing the work that he does, mentoring, young adults, with challenges with substance use, and really kind of helping individuals and families, is how he kind of multiplies that recovery kind of, over time. And he gets to just kind of pay that forward. And so that's one of the things that really sticks with me. And I'm just so grateful that we had anything to do with that process for Tyler, because he's so amazing.
Yeah, that's true. And it leads me into the thought that the something else he mentioned a lot is about the connection of family support in that. And connection is a term that came up a lot in our podcasts over the year. The connection to helping people, to each other, just connection is so important. Particularly, I think it came up a lot because of the fact that we were videoing and doing our podcast during COVID, where none of us had any connection. So I think just connection, you can never overstate the value of connection. Even if you're an introvert, you still need the connection, and connection keeps us in our recovery. So I think that's an important one. And you can probably talk to that clip another clip we have of Tyler.
The person of concern can start to heal pretty quick, but the family, sometimes it takes more time.
Awesome. Thanks, James. So, the thing that I think this is built on each other, right? Each episode kind of, we learn more. It broadens our view. Hopefully it broadens everybody else's view. But it also kind of leads to, how about we try this next? Or how about we have this guest on? And, and I do think kind of the conversation with Tyler about how he involves families and supports the whole family system, is really a great starting point for kind of one of our other favorite guests, right? And that's Maureen Kavanaugh, from Magnolia and New Beginnings. I'll say again, I read her book in 2 days, and I've actually been fortunate to have a lot of connection with Maureen since then. And so that's a real gift that this podcast, I think, has brought into, not just my life, but to Spectrum's and beyond. So, I wonder if we can kind of play, the clip from Maureen on her family support. I don't know if that's the order you have it in, or if you have the book title one in first.
Yep, we'll play your family support. I'll roll it.
Provide sober living scholarships through select mass health treatment centers, including Spectrum. We've worked, it's probably my longest relationship is with the people at the Farris Center and with Spectrum. So I loved Farris because I know it's changed a little bit, but it used to be 90 days. So people would come out in 90 days and they would use their benefit for halfway. So they couldn't go to a halfway. So they needed sober living, and we were able to provide sober living scholarships. But right now we work primarily with the Department of Corrections and with drug courts across the state of Massachusetts. And I do personally is I work as a family recovery coach. And what that is, I mean, it's a kind of a loose definition of family. So it's anybody that is a loved one of somebody who's struggling. But I also, I've done every training known to mankind. That's what I was saying. I trained with Bessel van der Kolk. And what I've been able to do is kind of look at something and say, you know what? I want to learn about this, and I want to learn about it with the person that created it. So I did craft training with Robert Myers. I've been able to do things like that and figure out what I needed when I was going through this and become trained in those things. I'm just finishing up my KDAC to be a licensed alcohol and drug counselor. So I'm just like a sponge anyhow. I always love school and educating myself, but I'm educating myself on all the things I felt that I needed when I was going through this so that I can help families as they go through it. Because if we can educate families, I was, during all those 40 different entries into some form of treatment, I had 3 family meetings. What is that? That's insane. There was no family support. There was very little family support, I should say. There was no direct support for me because I was a complete uninformed, uneducated maniac in the very beginning. And there was no help for me. So if we can start helping our families, I think that's a game changer. I've also created a program called FAST. It's Family Focused Addiction Support Training. And before COVID, I was booked all over the country to do these 4-day trainings, create family support meetings in different areas, through treatment centers, through community organizations, through a variety of places, and hospitals. And the goal was to train people on how to work with families. So it's NADAC approved. It's 21 CEUs for social workers and a variety of anybody in this state, anybody licensed by BSAS. So I tried to create this training so that I could educate the staff and different people in the community that are working with families on what families need and how they need to hear it. Because I can say things to families that somebody who maybe their case manager who's 27 may not feel comfortable saying because they're not a parent and they may not be comfortable hearing it from that person. But so it's a lot about communication too, and group dynamics, group facilitation. And so that's what I was doing before COVID. And I'm kind of resurrecting it a little bit. And we're training people to facilitate online groups both in Magnolia next month. So that we'll have two a week to begin with. We're going to bring in grief support groups. We're going to bring in sibling groups. And we're going to start having these online Zoom and streaming onto Magnolia groups. I'd like to see several a day, every day, so that people have someplace to go, because I feel like COVID, the isolation of COVID, the NAs and AA caught on pretty quickly, but there wasn't a lot for families. And we actually had a woman that passed away that committed suicide, and just the isolation was too much. And I know that was the final straw, the isolation.
Yeah, I think
Thanks so much for sharing that clip, James. And so, what you just heard Maureen kind of talk quite a bit about is kind of that family support and her perspective and her lived experience is one of the things that I think really has changed even my perspective. So something I think that we've always had a really strong focus on is family support. And actually, Maureen has said that she's had family members come up to her and say the only treatment program that my child went to that connected with me as a family member was New England Recovery Center. So I was really, pleased to hear that. But I always think we can do better. And the more we heard on the podcast with Maureen, the more time I've spent with her, and the more we hear about her new, Magnolia Fast program, the more I said we need to do this. And so, this is a great example of how this podcast not only changes, our perspectives, but it changes how we do things at Spectrum and New England Recovery Center. So, we actually are starting. We sent, myself included, 10 staff to Maureen's training on implementation of her FAST program, her Family and Addiction Support Program. And we are starting our first family support meeting virtually, just like this, on Zoom on Tuesday, July 13th at 6 p.m. So if anybody's interested, if you've got family members listening, support persons, or somebody who could benefit, it's open to the community at large. Keep an eye. The Zoom link will be shared, and people will be notified kind of on lots of ways, on our website, on our social media. So if you keep an eye on the New England Recovery Center page, there'll be announcements forthcoming, this week on what that link will look like. So I'm really excited to implement, this support meeting.
That begs me to ask the question, what do you think is the one thing that people will get out of that as a family member?
So she's got a wonderful structure. And so we've done family education and family support in multiple ways as an organization, often from that clinical perspective, right? Like, let me share with you the clinical perspective. Let me support you with clinical supports. And that's important. And there's a bit of psychoeducation to that. But what Maureen built into this program is, a structure of, what does the family need to hear? What do they need in this moment? And not just kind of, the clinical perspective. And so the structure of it is the topic changes every week. And so there's, about 20 minutes of psychoeducation on that topic, right? So we're providing good evidence-based, accurate information. And then it's about close to an hour of discussion and support and conversation based on that topic. So that opportunity, like you would in any kind of mutual support meeting, to support each other. The thing that I love about her program is the last part, which is about a 20-minute portion of the group when it's focused on self-care. And so, we often forget to do that, especially if we are going through and walking a recovery process with our loved one, just like Maureen so eloquently talks about, and you probably heard a little bit from her, or if you re-listen to that podcast, you'll hear it, or read her book, you'll certainly hear it. Or you may know this yourself, that how challenging it is for the support and loved ones, of somebody struggling with substance use disorder, and how you forget about self-care. Right?
Yeah, so you just want to fix it. I mean, you just want to fix the person. You can't. Yeah, I hear you.
Exactly. And I remember re-listening to that podcast recently, Cathy, and you so eloquently talked about, you can't love somebody out of this, right? Like if you could, then there would be no addiction, right? It would be over.
If love could cure all, we'd all be, gives me the chills.
Yeah. And so you have to take care of yourself in order so you can show up when it's ready. And so that could be a guide, teaching skills like guided meditation, breathing exercises, things that people can take with them. And so when they're in their environment, and having to manage all the things, that they have some skills for self-care. So they get to do it in that moment, as a group, and then it's a skill that they can use later. So that's what you can expect. So that it's lots of different topics around education, of course, around things like overdose and what medications are available and treatment options, but also boundaries, healthy boundaries, things that building kind of family teams, the impact of trauma. It's going to be some really important information, support, and self-care, right? Those are the things that you'll get out of that. So I really encourage folks to go to that, keep an eye on that page. And so that brings me to kind of one of our guests. And I don't think we have a clip from him, but I want to talk a little bit about it. And that's Jesse's story. And so Jesse is an employee at New England Recovery Center with lived experience, and he's very free and open with his story. But his role at New England Recovery Center is that of a family engagement specialist. And so Jesse went through the training with me. He'll be one of the facilitators in this ongoing kind of weekly meeting. And Jesse really, had some wonderful things to say about needing to engage the family, and needing to have that buy-in from the family. And I don't know if anybody remembers anything from that episode.
Yes, I remember wanting to jump through the screen and hug him. I remember the hope he inspired in me, that I just felt so joyful for his family. They had him back, and now he has this beautiful life, a beautiful wife and family. And it's like all of that would not have been possible had he not found recovery. And now he can impart that so that other people, not only other patients and people in recovery, but he can give that hope to families. I think critical. I mean, I remember that episode so well, and thinking this is when COVID was really bad, because I wanted to be able to just hug him and thank him for that, because he's going to be a terrific trainer for that, I believe, because he's just has such a way with imparting his feelings and emotions behind it. So I think he was a great choice for the training as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we've talked a lot about like the positive things, right? Hope, connection, recovery. But I think we've also spent some time kind of talking about the challenges, right? And that this is not an easy road, and recognizing what makes the road to recovery more difficult, and why it's not so easy to achieve. And so, I think, kind of back to kind of Maureen Kavanaugh's podcast, I would love to, if we could maybe share the clip on her book title, and kind of how they called "If You Loved Me," and kind of where that came from, because that was really impactful, I think, to me, listening to her say that.
Sure, let me roll the clip.
Share where the title of the book comes from?
No.
So there was one night after multiple relapses, and I would say this is probably about 3/4 of the way into the story. And she was doing good, and she's doing well, and she was happy, really happy that she was doing well, and she seemed to be putting everything together, and she relapsed again. And she had at this time been at a sober living up in New Hampshire. So some great people that she was in a couple of the sober houses associated with this treatment center got together and went and looked for her. And she had taken off. They're looking for her all over the place. I'm calling her over and over again. Finally, I fall asleep. About 3 o'clock in the morning, I get a knock on the door and they're bringing her home. Awesome, awesome person that she, that I love dearly to this day, made sure she got home. And she comes in. She didn't want to come in, but I kind of dragged her in. And she's sitting on my kitchen floor and she's crying and she's just so incredibly distraught and unhappy. And I looked at her and I said, sweetie, I love you so much and you're going to die. And she looked up at me and she said, if you love me, you'd let me die. So this is the depth of the sorrow and the self-hatred and just the depression that goes along with drug use. She didn't want to be in this situation. It wasn't any fun anymore. But
Wonderful. That was a great clip about the book. Both Lisa and I were so impressed with the sort of the background story behind the title. If you loved me, we just said, if you could love someone through this.
And I think it did she did such a wonderful job describing kind of why she chose that title and the recognition she had for just how much pain her daughter was in, right? And how much pain, individuals with substance use disorder are in, that it's not fun anymore, right? I think is what she said. This is not fun anymore. This is not, I'm not kind of, chasing this high. If you loved me, you would let me die.
Yeah.
And, and I think that just highlights the how challenging a road it is. And it makes me think of kind of one of our more recent podcasts on trauma, where we had Dr. Zlatina Kostova on from UMass, and talking about, that it's so common that, many individuals with substance use disorder have a trauma history. And they might have a trauma history that predates and kind of leads to kind of using substances as coping. But also sometimes the paths of addiction lead people to be in places that put them in settings where they might, obtain kind of trauma. And so how that really complicates recovery. It's still, of course, completely possible, but it's really helpful, I think, to share those things too, to recognize, why it's not that easy. Right? Like why it might be really difficult for some folks to kind of find that recovery path, because they're dealing with, not just the impact on your brain with active substance use, but the impact on your brain from trauma. Right? And you're dealing with both of those things impacting your brain and making it hard to make decisions that, we would want people to make, that we just kind of want to say, why don't you just make a different choice? And so that really, I think, I tie those together quite a bit.
I agree. And I thought the trauma episode we did with her was really fascinating because, like you say, I don't think we're all even aware of the underlying. We just know that at some point, drugs and alcohol came into the picture. Potentially, there's an underlying trauma behind everyone's story. And I think that was very enlightening for me. And she was a wonderful guest. And I have to point out the power of Zoom, and she was in Bulgaria, I believe, when we did that episode. So like we've had West Coast, we've had Bulgaria. I don't think a lot of podcasts have had guests from all over. So that was great.
I guess from all over. Pretty cool.
Yeah. Around the world.
You never know, right? From the production standpoint, James, like it was no different than if she were up the road, right?
Yeah, she was right here.
Like the other side of the world.
The power of our producer made it seamless. And then another guest talking about challenges, some of the challenges that people have. Obviously, if people die of overdoses, what is left behind? Families are left behind, children are left behind. And then oftentimes, and I think there's a very large population of people where grandparents are raising their grandchildren because the parents have overdosed and passed. It's tragic. It really is tragic. But how do you address that? And I think the interview we had with Sarah Cloud and Teresa Harmon was incredible. They each have books that they can reference that are helpful to those children. That's a whole other trauma. But if you want to sort of talk about that, the overdose support they gave us
Yeah, and it's another example of kind of this podcast bringing connections together. We've been able to connect, actually, Dr. Kostova Zlatina's team to, Teresa Harmon's team and to Sarah Cloud, and share kind of those resources where they're working with, their trauma focused therapists working with kids, right? And so kind of sharing that kind of the parental substance use is often connected to that, whether it's, grief from overdose or just the absence of a parent when they're in treatment or, unavailable and grandparents have to raise them. And so, really having kind of some wonderful guests that have just sought to, okay, this is a challenge. What can I do about it? And I think Sarah Cloud's a great example of that as well. Recognizing there's not a lot of resources for kids to understand this disease of addiction, to understand why mommy's not here anymore because mommy overdosed, and do it in a really positive way, right? It's not that mommy didn't care about you, right? That Mama Paca book is a wonderful book. You can order it on Amazon. And so if anybody wants to look at that, you can also get a list of a lot of other books on their Mama Paca, I think it's mamapaca.com or .org, and list a lot of resources. You can also get kind of a stuffed kind of mama to, with a piece of, fabric from the parent or loved one, and just how do you turn such a challenging thing into support, right? Into connection, right? To tie back to kind of, one of our earlier themes. And Teresa Harmon really similarly, right? How do it's dealing with neonatal abstinence syndrome, right? It's just a reality of having a child when you have an opiate use disorder. That's just part of it. And we don't know a lot about kind of the long-term impacts. There's not a lot of support for families. So whether it's, families in recovery, that's often who that we're supporting is, parents who are now in recovery, but maybe weren't at that time. But also, foster parents like she is, or adoptive parents, grandparents, anybody who is supporting these kids. And I just love how kind of that ripple effect of being able to connect people has been possible with this.
I totally agree. And along the same lines, the stigma is taken out of it. When we have that conversation, it's so easy to sit back and judge a situation, but taking the stigma out takes so much more work. And I think that Teresa just did a great job of explaining it and really embracing it as an illness or a disorder versus anything that you would cast judgment on. And I think that's another thing that I took out of that particular episode, with lots of compassion, because if it were very simple, then no one would be in that situation. So I think that was a great episode too, which another along those same lines in the stigma, we were very fortunate to have Dr. Komaromi.
And before the podcast, so I'm good at it now.
And Julie from Rise talking about the language, how important language is, and that sort of ties into what we just said about the neonatal syndrome. Changing the stigma by changing the language, and to me, that's all very relevant information.
And I think what podcasts can do, like I think we even use kind of podcasts like ours as an example of what we can do to change that, right? So we can model when we talk the language that we would use, that person first language. So that's one of the things that really struck me in that podcast. I think that Dr. Miriam Komaromi, I'll probably said it differently this time, but she's lovely. But she did a great job talking about person first language, right? And talking about how we don't say, we don't say, the person, like the diabetic down the corner, like they've changed that, like the diabetic in room 13, that we've changed that to the individual with diabetes, right? And that we need to do the same thing with substance use disorder, instead of using terms like the addict, referring to ourselves or to others in labeling as an addict. It's a person with substance use disorder. It's a person first. And this is only a part of what their experience is, and not all of them, right? It's not like we don't say that the only thing that defines somebody with diabetes is diabetes, right? They're a father, mother, a son, an employee, like they're all of these things we see as a whole person, and we only see diabetes as a little bit of it. But yet when we use terms like addict, like I'm an addict or that person's an addict, it becomes their whole
identity. Yeah, it becomes who they are.
Right.
As opposed to, I'm all of this. Oh, and I'm in recovery.
Right.
Yeah.
And so even when you refer to yourself, Cathy, right, you say, I'm a woman in recovery, right? That's how you describe yourself.
Right.
And you're putting yourself first, right? First, you're a woman first, right?
I'm a woman first. I'm in recovery.
That's part of you.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Well, as we come near the end of this episode, because we try to be promptly around 45 minutes each episode, I would be remiss if I didn't do my question of the episode. And I did give you guys a heads up because it's important. But my favorite thing over the course of the podcast has been asking people for their favorite books or references or podcasts that they listen to. And I have compiled a big list, which I'm going to figure out how I can get that implemented and put onto our New England Recovery Center Facebook page. So there will be a place to get all the resources because there are so many resources. Things such as Learn to Cope, Magnolia New Beginning, the BGCbridge.com, Recovery Law, in case you're in trouble with the law. So there's so many resources, so many books and podcasts, but I love hearing what my fellow podcasters here like to listen to. So James, would you like to throw us your favorite podcast?
Sure. So, me being in tech, I think it's kind of obvious. I like some tech podcasts. So one of them is I like the WAN Show. Those are playing along at home. That's the latest tech tips YouTube channel podcast. So I just like staying on top of current technology, just staying current and seeing what's out there and stuff. Because being current is how I can stay on top of the game here and be able to find more technology that can serve others. And it's always important to be in the know.
Yeah.
We love that. We need you for that.
You got it.
If you do it, I don't have to, right?
Exactly.
Well, I couldn't do it without you guys. So it's mutual.
Yeah, thank you. Lisa, what would you say your favorite podcast is?
So my favorite podcast actually ties to some themes we've talked a lot about in our podcast, and that is mindfulness and and that's actually one of the future directions I'd love to take this podcast is talking about mindfulness, but especially in the pandemic. I think really kind of, I've practiced meditation for a long time, but I really dove into it in the past year and a half, and have taken the mindfulness-based stress reduction program that John Kabat-Zinn did, but I regularly listen to the 10% Happier podcast with Dan Harris. He's got wonderful guests who really are kind of experts in that area, but are also really accessible and really relevant. And so, that is probably, aside from ours, of course, probably my favorite podcast.
This has become my favorite as well. I do have one that I listen to regularly. I'm a complete junkie for it. It's called the Dopey Podcast. And it's potentially, I love it because it's all the dopey stories of dopey things people have done when they were on drugs and alcohol. It keeps in my mind, why I never want to go back there, because this stupid dopey stuff happens when you're on drugs and alcohol. They've had a lot of different guests too. And it was started by two people who met in recovery at a treatment center. One happened to have gone out and overdosed and died. But the other host has continued the journey of it. I think it speaks to reality. And they have the father on a lot, who I really appreciate because that taps into the family element of it. So, and I like humor. I think we all need more humor in our lives, more laughter. So with that, if we were going to sort of project into our coming episodes and how we see the next year unfolding, the one thing that kept coming to mind for me, which you just mentioned, and I'll let you wrap up this episode, but it's mindfulness and more training or ideas around self-care, because it's so critical. So with that, I'll let you throw out there your thoughts. And I appreciate you, and I appreciate you, James.
Yes. And both of you, I mean, I definitely couldn't do this on my own. I think this is something that really takes all three of us to do this and do it well. So I look forward to every time that we record this and plan the next one. And so as we think to plan future ones, again, I would love to have mindfulness. I love the idea around self-care, what supports support options are available. I'd also love to spend some more time kind of breaking down stigma and kind of challenging kind of what is out there that still is stigmatizing, that is stopping folks from coming into care. Right? I'd love to even look at like more diversity, more podcasts on racial and ethnic diversity, more podcasts on LGBTQ plus, and even the intersection of those, and just hearing from other experts that will really broaden my knowledge. Therefore, kind of I can share that with the clinical teams at Spectrum New England Recovery Center, but also the knowledge of anybody listening.
That's a wonderful way to look toward our future on this podcast. And I would put a shout out there, any of our loyal listeners, which I'm sure we have a few, if you have ideas and thoughts, please feel free to reach out to us on the episode. Lisa, myself, James, any of us, we're happy to take your feedback and work the podcast in any direction of your choosing, as long as it's informative and helps in the addiction community, because that's really what we're looking to do. So with that, another great episode, guys.
Yeah.
It's been a year.
All right. As I say in production, that's a wrap. Take care, folks.